From Evander Holyfield being robbed against Nikolai Valuev, to Roy Jones Jr. being victim to some of the worst officiating at the Olympics, these are the most unfair decisions in boxing history. Starting things off, we have the time Valuev was gifted a win by the judges back in 2008. Even though Evander was way past his prime, he ended up putting on an amazing show. So if you watched the fight, you'd know that he did more than enough to win the bout. Meanwhile, Valuev did absolutely nothing, as he barely threw any punches, allowing Holyfield to do some damage instead. Despite that, the Russian giant was handed the win by the judges, even though you could make the argument that he lost 10 of the 12 rounds. Heck, every major media outlet had Evander winning, including Sports Illustrated, which gave Holyfield 10 of the 12 rounds and scored it 118 to 110 in his favor. Anyone with two eyes would have come to the decision, or at least one that was close to that. But I guess the judges saw something else. It was disgraceful because Holyfield was robbed of winning a heavyweight title. But hey, at least he'd already achieved so much in the past that it didn't matter. As bad as this robbery was, though, it wasn't as bad as what Gennady Golovkin had to deal with in 2017. When Canelo and Triple G finally faced off for the first time, the boxing world went wild because it was a dream match like no other. Everyone was dying to see which of the two men would come out on top and cement themselves as one of the GOATs of this era. The fight was amazing, but it looked obvious that Golovkin had done enough to win a close but clear decision over the Mexican. But because of Adelaide Byrd, that didn't happen. Byrd's embarrassing scorecard had the fight 118 to 110 in favor of Canelo, while only 2 rounds were given to Triple G. So instead of getting the biggest win of his career, he was forced to accept a majority draw, all because one judge chose to be an idiot. Golovkin's trainer was so appalled by the scorecard that he said Byrd probably filled it out before the fight even started. The unfair decision sparked a trilogy between both men, and the same goes for Erik Morales and Marco Antonio, Barrera's first fight. The unbeaten Morales was favored to win over Marco, but the Mexican ended up doing much better than expected. The fight was full of back-and-forth action, but Barrera's left hook proved to be too much for Erik. On top of that, Marco scored a knockdown in the final minute of the fight, so it seemed like he pulled off the upset. 2 of the judges didn't see it that way though, as they gave Morales a split decision victory, which was complete and utter BS. The same goes for Oscar De La Hoya's fight against Felix Sturm in 2004. Even though the Golden Boy was on the wrong end of unfair decisions in the past, he's also benefited from one. De La Hoya was warming up for a super fight for the ages against Bernard Hopkins, and fought Sturm at middleweight. Everyone thought this would be an easy fight for Oscar, but that couldn't have been any further from the truth. Felix put on a show and completely shut down De La Hoya. But you know how boxing can be. Since they didn't want the super fight to be in jeopardy, the judges pretty much rigged the fight in favor of Oscar, as he won 115 to 113 on all scorecards. But those scores really only made sense for Sturm. A more recent robbery came in 2022 when Josh Taylor went up against Jack Catterall. They were fighting in Taylor's country for the undisputed super lightweight titles, so the stakes were high. But it was clear as day that Josh didn't do enough that night. Catterall was dominating Taylor and setting the pace, boxing his way on the back foot and even bloodying Taylor's face. On top of that, he knocked down Josh in the 8th round as well. Despite all that, Josh was awarded the split decision win, and Catterall was obviously pissed as he tweeted out, "What a load of bull" after the fight. Moving on, we have George Foreman being robbed by Shannon Briggs in 1997. Even though Briggs was 23 years younger, Foreman's experience allowed him to control the tempo for most of the fight, so Shannon couldn't take advantage of the fact that he was up against a grandpa. Big George delivered a remarkable display that night, and of course, who can forget how dominant he was in the last 2 rounds of the fight, while Shannon the Cannon couldn't even lay a glove in response. Foreman owned him so badly that he broke his nose towards the end of the fight, so it looked like a victory for Big George was almost certain. But instead, it was Briggs who was handed the W. Foreman's career officially came to an end after one of the most unfair decisions, as he retired soon after the fight. Though some might call this decision karma because, before this fight, Foreman himself benefited from a robbery when he went up against Alex Schultz. While the decision was awful, it wasn't as disheartening as the outcome when Holyfield went up against Lennox Lewis in 1999. The stakes were as high as you could imagine, as the sport was about to crown the first undisputed heavyweight champion in 7 years. While the fight wasn't totally one-sided since Holyfield put up a fight, it was still obvious that Lennox should be declared the winner. Despite that, it was a majority draw, causing everyone to feel incredibly disappointed. One scorecard was the cause of this because it had Holyfield winning the 5th round, even though he stayed pinned back on the ropes for the entire round thanks to Lennox's aggression. Yeah, you heard that right. I guess that judge had money on Holyfield because there's no way anyone with a brain would ever come to such a conclusion. Thanks to their bizarre scoring, we were robbed of a beautiful and historic night.
Lewis has got a fight.
And thanks to BS scoring, Manny Pacquiao lost his first fight in 7 years when he fought Tim Bradley. Pac-Man was dominating Bradley when they met in 2012, as he rocked the American a bunch of times and landed 253 blows to Tim's 159. ESPN scored the bout 119-109 to Manny, and we thought that this would be an easy unanimous decision win for Pacquiao. But that didn't happen. 2 of the judges somehow came to the conclusion that Bradley won the fight 115-113, robbing Manny of a much-deserved win. The decision was so bad that Larry Merchant said the decision was a crime. And I'll have to agree with him on that. What's even more confusing about the result is that Manny was the bigger name compared to Bradley. So if there was anyone you'd expect them to rig it for, you'd think it'd be for the Pac-Man. Either way, all I know is that these judges are almost always a joke. That was especially the case for the fight between Julio Cesar Chavez and Pernell Whitaker in 1993. In what was supposed to be one of the greatest fights of all time that would crown boxing's pound-for-pound #1, we instead got one of the worst decisions ever. Chavez entered the fight 87-0, but he should have left with the first loss of his career as Whitaker put on a masterful performance. It looked like Pernell was going to be crowned the pound-for-pound king of boxing, but the judges had other plans as they scored it a majority draw. Literally every member of the media had Whitaker winning, but Chavez had the audacity to act like he won the fight, which just pissed some boxing fans off even more. Sadly for Pernell though, this wasn't the only time he got robbed big time. He was challenging Jose Luis Ramirez in 1988 in Paris, while the lightweight world title was on the line. Whitaker handled Ramirez with ease all fight long, and that's why British judge Harry Gibbs scored it 118-113 for Pernell. But his scorecard was negated by the other 2 judges, who treated the boxing world to one of the worst robberies of all time. Whitaker was so disappointed that he fell to his knees, but at least he got his revenge a year later. Now for the biggest robbery in boxing history, it came in 1988 when Park Si-Hun went up against Roy Jones Jr. The most horrendous boxing decision didn't come in the pro game, but in the Olympics. Roy Jones had put on a show, and he looked dominant all throughout the fight, so it was obvious that he deserved a unanimous decision victory. Yet the judges chose to gift the win to Park Si-Hun instead. The decision was so bad that Park himself apologized to Roy Jones and said that he'd rather the decision be fairly handed back to his opponent. The crowd was in shock, so they booed the decision as hard as they could. It was a disgraceful decision, so hopefully the people responsible for it never got to judge another fight. So from Evander Holyfield being robbed against Nikolai Valuev to Roy Jones Jr. being victim to some of the worst officiating at the Olympics, those were the most unfair decisions in boxing history.